Okay, so are you ready to put on your explorer hats, everybody? Because today we are going way back in time, like 8,000 years ago, back to ancient India.
8,000
I
years.
know, it's hard to even fathom that, isn't it?
Yeah, it really
I
is.
mean, that's like even before the pyramids were built by thousands of years, we're talking really ancient history. But this chapter, we're diving into introduction. What, where, how, and when.
It goes right for the big question, like, how do we even know what we know about a time this far back?
Right.
It's not like we have photographs or, firsthand accounts. It's
Yeah.
more like trying to put together a puzzle with, like, most of the pieces missing. Yeah. It is a lot like that. We really only have the pieces of the puzzle that survived, which would be things like little bits of pottery or ancient tools or maybe some crumbling walls and foundations of buildings. And archaeologists are kind of like detectives in a way.
Oh, totally.
They have to take those little pieces and try to reconstruct a whole picture of what life was like back then.
Exactly. And I think what I find so fascinating is that it's not always the big, obvious things.
Yeah.
Like you don't need a giant monument to tell you something amazing about the past.
No, you don't.
Like imagine finding a handful of like charred seeds at an archaeological site.
Oh, yeah.
You might think, well, it's not that exciting. But those tiny little seeds can tell us so much about what people ate back then. How they farmed, even what the climate was like.
Exactly. It paints a picture.
It really does. And it makes you realize that history is about so much more than just, kings and queens and battles. It's about like regular people, how they live their everyday lives.
It really is.
What did they eat? What was it like to walk in their shoes?
Yeah.
So speaking of walking in their shoes, this chapter takes us on this journey, across this ancient landscape. We're talking about places like the Suleiman Hills and the Narmada River.
Yeah.
Can you kind of set the scene for us? Like, why were these places important back then?
Okay. Well, picture yourself 8,000 years ago and you're standing on the Suleiman Hills. Okay. And all around you are the very first farmers in the area, and they're carefully planting their crops, things like barley and wheat, which was revolutionary back then. It changed everything about how people lived.
And then you fast forward a bit, and we're on the banks of the Indus River, and suddenly we've gone from these quiet hills to these thriving cities, some of the earliest cities in the world, full of trade and art and all kinds of new ideas.
I mean, it's incredible to think about how those places transformed, right?
It is.
And it wasn't just about people staying put in one place either. This chapter mentions something I find really interesting, which is the movement of people.
Yes.
Like merchants, crossing mountains with their goods. And as they traveled, they weren't just trading goods, they were also spreading ideas and culture.
It's like they were connecting the different parts of the ancient world. It's really quite fascinating.
It is, and it's easy to forget that, people thousands of years ago were driven by a lot of the same things we are today, like that urge to explore, to connect with other people, to build a better life. Absolutely.
And those journeys, even though they were dangerous, even though they were full of uncertainty, they really did shape history.
They did.
And speaking of shaping history, this chapter delves into those two names for this region, India and Farad.
Right.
I mean, we kind of use them interchangeably today, but their origins are pretty different, aren't they?
They are, yeah. And, while both names are deeply connected to this land, India, as we use it today, it's actually kind of a newer name historically.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So India actually comes from the Indus River Sindhu in Sanskrit.
Okay.
And it was the ancient Greeks, who really started using it when they came to the region about 2,500 years ago, because it was just their way of referring to the land and the people they encountered who lived beyond that river.
Okay, so the Greeks were the ones who kind of put India on the map, so to speak.
In a way, yes.
But Farad, that's a whole other story.
Yes. Farad has much deeper roots. We're talking way back to the Rig Veda.
The Rig Veda.
This incredible collection of ancient hymns that dates back an astounding 3,500 years.
3,500 years.
I know. It's mind-boggling, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, think about that. A name that has been passed down and used for over 3,000 years. It's just incredible.
Yeah, it speaks to the enduring legacy of that name.
Absolutely. And the Rig Veda itself, I mean, that's like a direct link to a time so far removed from our own, and yet here we are still learning from it.
Exactly.
But I have to ask, how do we even know about a text that old, like 3,500 years? Imagine trying to preserve a book for even a couple of hundred years, let alone thousands.
I know. It really is amazing how these things survive, isn't it?
It is.
But it really does show you how much these texts were revered, how carefully they were preserved and passed down through generations. We're talking about manuscripts written on palm leaves or birch bark.
Oh, wow.
Incredibly delicate materials, but they were meticulously cared for centuries.
It makes you think about all the things they must have done to protect them from, the elements, insects, just the ravages of time.
It's remarkable, isn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
But I imagine manuscripts weren't the only way people recorded their history.
Oh, no, not at all.
What else did they use?
Well, inscriptions were also really important, carving words into stone or metal, something a little more durable.
Ah, so it lasts longer.
Exactly, and those could survive for a really long time. The chapter even talks about kings inscribing details of their victories on pillars and tablets.
Oh, right, like their own little PR campaigns.
Exactly, boasting about their accomplishments for everyone to see.
For all of eternity.
Exactly, etched in stone forever.
But I'm guessing it wasn't just kings using inscriptions, right?
You're right, everyday people use them too for all sorts of things. Prayers, dedications, even just simple messages.
Wow, so what we might write on a postcard today, they were carving in stone.
In a way, yes.
That's amazing. And speaking of amazing inscriptions, the chapter mentions a really intriguing one from a place called Kandahar, dating back 2,250 years.
Oh, yes, that one's fascinating.
What makes it so special?
Well, for one thing, it's written in two languages, Greek and Aramaic.
Whoa, 2 languages on one inscription. What were they talking about that needed 2 languages?
Right?
That's so cool. It's like stumbling upon an ancient conversation frozen in time.
Exactly. It just goes to show you even something as seemingly simple as an inscription can be a window into a much bigger story.
Absolutely. It makes you wonder what else is out there just waiting to be discovered.
I think that's what makes studying history so captivating. You never know what you're going to find next.
It really makes you think about how interconnected the world was even back then.
It does, doesn't it?
I mean, even thousands of years ago, people were juggling multiple languages and cultures just like we do today.
Exactly.
Kind of makes you realize, the past wasn't this like isolated, distant time. It was just as vibrant and complex as the world we live in now.
Absolutely.
And speaking of complexity, this chapter emphasizes, not just how interconnected everything was, but also the idea that there wasn't just one single past.
Right.
Like history wasn't the same experience for everyone.
Exactly. It's so easy to fall into that trap of thinking, the past, it all happened in one way. But the reality is there were so many different experiences, so many different perspectives.
Yeah, like we were saying earlier about, history being about more than just kings and queens.
Right.
There were farmers and merchants, craftspeople, all experiencing the world in their own way.
Absolutely. Think about it. The life of a wealthy merchant traveling to far-off lands, bringing back exotic goods and stories, compared to, say, a farmer who might live their entire life within a few miles of where they were born.
Totally different worlds.
Exactly, both shaped by the events of their time, but experiencing them in such different ways.
It's like that old saying, walk a mile in someone else's shoes.
Exactly.
And this chapter uses such a great example to illustrate this whole idea. The Andaman Islanders.
Yeah.
Even today, many of them live in ways that would have been familiar to our ancestors from thousands of years ago. I mean, hunting, fishing, gathering.
It's like their past is still woven into their present.
It really is. And it kind of challenges our own ideas about progress, doesn't it?
It does.
Like we tend to think about history as this linear progression.
Yeah.
Every era more advanced than the last. But the Andaman Islanders, they show us that there are different ways of living and thriving in the world.
They really do.
It's like holding up a mirror to our own assumptions about what it means to be civilized.
I like that.
And their story, juxtaposed against those bustling cities of ancient India, it highlights the sheer diversity of human experience.
Absolutely. Even within the same historical period, you have this incredible range of ways of life.
And it makes you wonder, whose stories are we missing from the historical record?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
Like, we tend to know more about the people who could, afford to commission a giant monument.
Yeah.
Or have their stories inscribed on a stone tablet.
Right, the people in power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the everyday lives of, the farmers, the weavers, the potters, those stories are often harder to find.
It's like trying to understand a whole symphony, but you can only hear a few of the instruments.
That's a great way to put it.
But archaeology, it helps us uncover some of those missing voices, those whispers of everyday life.
It's like detective work, right?
Exactly. We have to piece together those fragments of pottery and tools with the same care that we give to deciphering ancient texts.
Because within those fragments, we find those human stories, the ones that remind us that even thousands of years ago, people loved and laughed and grieved and dreamed just like we do today. And speaking of time, something else that struck me in this chapter was how it talks about the way we measure time itself.
Oh, how so?
Well, you know the BCAD system.
Right.
Versus something called BP. I'll admit BCAD, that's always been my go-to.
Sure.
Is BP something I need to brush up on?
Well, it's definitely worth knowing about. It stands for before present.
Before present.
Yeah, so instead of using a fixed point in history, like the birth of Christ.
Which is what BCAD is based on.
Right. BP measures time backward from the present day.
Interesting.
So it's a more neutral approach in a way because it acknowledges that the present is always changing.
That's a really interesting point.
It's like we're choosing where to stand when we look back at the past. And that vantage point, it shapes our whole perspective.
And maybe even what we choose to focus on, right?
Exactly what we decide is important enough to remember and study.
I mean, it's true, though, isn't it? When you really think about it, like, even the way we talk about time is shaped by, our own perspectives and biases.
It is.
And that's what makes studying history so fascinating, right?
It does.
It's not just about memorizing facts and figures. It's about, grappling with these big questions.
Exactly.
About understanding how our own views color the way we see the past.
It's like we're all detectives trying to piece together this giant puzzle.
I like that.
A puzzle that might never even be finished.
Right, exactly. And this chapter, it's given us this incredible toolkit for how to even begin to understand, the world of ancient India.
It has.
But like you were saying, it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Oh, yeah, just the beginning. And that's what makes this whole field so exciting. Every discovery, every inscription, every little piece of pottery could completely change our understanding of the past.
Reminds me of what you were saying earlier about how even a simple inscription, with those two languages could hold these untold stories.
Exactly.
It's that sense of mystery that keeps me coming back for more.
I agree.
That there's always something new to uncover.
And that's what we've tried to do today, give you a taste of that mystery, of that incredible richness and complexity that we find in ancient India.
We've just scratched the surface, really.
We have, but hopefully we've sparked your curiosity.
Exactly. As you dive deeper into this period, keep asking those questions. Keep looking for those hidden connections. And remember that there are so many different perspectives that have shaped this incredible tapestry of the past.
That's right.
Because behind every single date, every artifact, every inscription are the lives and experiences of real people.
It's their stories that we're trying to tell.
Their stories that we're still uncovering. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep learning, because the past, it really does have so much to teach us if we just take the time to listen.
I couldn't agree more.